The Awakening, from the Fempiror Chronicles, by George Willson. Chapter 18, Before the Storm. Zechariah rested on one of the beds, his eyes open as he stared at the cave ceiling. David was one of the first people to go to sleep, which came as no surprise to anyone. He had not been a Fempiror but for a few days, and Zechariah had forgotten that the body continues its transmutation for several days after the initial change, causing the new Fempiror to be more tired than he might normally be. Yori had also fallen asleep quickly to allow her body to heal. The wound did not cut deep, and she said she could fight later if needed, but he knew they would wait and see about that. He, Tiberius, and Caltesh had followed suit soon after. Zechariah had not rested long, but then he never really did. Even when he was human, he did not require a great deal of sleep, no matter how long he stayed awake, and this habit had followed him after his transmutation. He was awake, and sleep was not going to take him again for some time. What he was considering was David's tale of what happened to him after the two Tepish had taken him from his room. They had pressed David for this before they allowed him to sleep, and he had been more than willing to tell what he knew. 4 of them were standing around my bed when I woke up, David had said, but 2 of them stayed behind when you came in. The other 2 carried me through a long hall, out through another room that looked like mine, and into that big room where you found me. You saw how they tied me up in the middle of that room. They had nodded to this, and David continued. Waiting for me in that room was the man that was with Ulrich in his throne room, David said, and Tiberius recalled his name was Nikolai. Yes, Nikolai walked up to me and said, "Welcome to my world." Since I couldn't move or speak, I just looked at him as he walked around me. "Oh, don't bother to struggle," he said. "Your life will end soon enough." I tried to break the ropes, but I guess I'm not as strong as you said I was. At this point, Zechariah had pointed out that their strength has a limit, and the Fempiror had fashioned Japrinsa in the early days to hold Fempiror prisoners captive. Fortunately, Japrinsa was only made to hold prisoners, so it is easy enough for captors to untie it, which is how Tiberius was able to free him so easily. "I could see that you are new to our world," he continued, standing in front of me. "I wondered which of my Redel Kurts changed you. I have an idea, but you'll have to help me with it. Was it Zechariah who found you initially?" he asked. I nodded, and he smiled. "Well, this is a surprise. I was beginning to think that Rufus was completely useless out there." "It was Rufus, wasn't it?" he asked me. I nodded again. Nikolai nodded in response and then laughed. "He might have been useful after all, but I imagine Zechariah killed him. He was always so devoted." Nikolai turned from me and paced. "His devotion and that of the others will be their downfall. Of course they'll know this is a trap," he told me. "There is not an idiot among them. However, this is a trap of conscience, not cunning. What would they not do for the innocent?" He looked at me as if I was going to answer him, and then he smiled again. "Look around you," he said. "They won't fall for it, but they won't have a choice." Then he leaned in real close and said, "Enjoy the view." He laughed and walked away, and I saw the other fighters moving into position outside the doors and on the upper level. "I watched for you for a while, but I was beginning to think you might not come." They had assured David that they would not have abandoned him in his time of need. He was one of them now, and they do not leave one of their own in danger like that, not without trying to bring them back. David asked if he could sleep without any further discussion, and Zechariah assured him he could now. There was some talk about Vladimir and where he might have ended up. Ulrich assured them he would send some Alewo out to search for him so that the Rostim could finally rest. They agreed and lay down. Zechariah heard voices speaking not too far from him. He turned his head and saw Ulrich sitting in the main cave with Tiberius. He wondered when Tiberius had gotten up and walked past him. "This is a beautiful cave, Ulrich," Tiberius said. Ulrich nodded. It is rare we can take advantage of the sun, Ulrich said, and it sounded like he was smiling. But I always love it here. What will you do? Tiberius asked. Zechariah sat up and watched them. The Tepish have run us out of our home, Ulrich said. My hope was that Fertide could solicit a larger force. His voice betrayed the severe disappointment of the number that had come. Zechariah stood and walked up behind them. There wasn't much left of him when he got there, Zechariah said. We left as soon as we could. Ulrich looked up at Zechariah. His strength had been exchanged for sadness in those deep eyes, an emotion that unlikely ever showed through, but he allowed it now that he was among people with a similar history. We cannot stay in this place because they are intelligent enough to find it, Ulrich said. We have to leave. The safe house at Charybdis is small and easily compromised, Tiberius said. Who do you still know? Ulrich shook his head. I have been in scarce contact with anyone from the old days, he said. We live a lonely life, Tiberius. These Tepish brought the Levicarts with them. We did not have them before. No need. This place would have been perfect for a refuge, Tiberius said. Yes, Ulrich agreed. He stared at the floor, apparently thinking very hard about what to do. This place has been our refuge, the refuge for me and the others who came with Shufruk when the Alewo decided to live a solitary life many years ago. He brought us here, and when he died, he placed the care of the new and old Alewo to me. Our new additions simply stumble into the caves, and we take them in. After 400 years, I know nothing else. Kaltesh walked up beside Zechariah. Then why can't you remain here? Kaltesh asked. Ulrich shook his head. I know the Tepish numbers, he said, more than most. It is suicidal to remain here. Then let's get rid of them, Kaltesh declared. Zechariah shook his head. We do not have the numbers, Tiberius said, echoing Zechariah's thoughts. If I had brought a larger force, perhaps, but not as we are. He said these people were captured in the last 25 years, Kaltesh said. That means they are inexperienced. Kaltesh, you are inexperienced, Tiberius said with a sigh. I have been practicing with you for the last 180 years, Kaltesh said indignantly. But consider the environments, Tiberius said. They were brought here to fight. They probably train daily in both practice and potentially deadly situations. It would not be unheard of for them to place real blades in trainees' hands to weed out the weaklings. Their entire life would depend on their skill in battle. By contrast, you learned your skills slowly over many years. We practiced regularly, but not daily. You came as often as you desired, and since we had no war looming, there was no urgency to it. Truly, today was your first actual experience in battle, meaning that despite years of training, you have very little experience. But I held my own today, Kaltesh pointed out. As did I, Yori said, appearing beside him. The younger Rostem appeared resolute in their intent to show off their skills in battle, and it was true they did very well today when it came to what amounted to their first live battle experience. There had not been any real chance to use the skills they had learned, and today allowed them to refine their abilities against live opponents. Tiberius looked at Zechariah, who held out his hand to show Tiberius he was fine with the idea. Tiberius shook his head. Zechariah, this is folly. Perhaps, Zechariah said, but we have a responsibility here. It is only their good will that allowed the Tepish to move in after I found them. Undoubtedly our presence sparked what just occurred. We owe it to them. If this seems wise to you, Ulrich said, a glimmer of hope showing through, the Alewo will welcome your help. Tiberius closed his eyes, crossed his arms, and dropped his head. He took a deep breath and then let it out in a concerned sigh. This is very risky, he said. It would put a severe dent in the Tepish forces, Zechariah pointed out. This was the chance he had been hoping for when Fertide had first appeared in Charybdis, a chance to stop the Tepish. If we die, Tiberius said, we help no one. The council will dismiss the incident if they ever hear of it. We could win, Zechariah said confidently. How? Tiberius asked. "You know how," Zechariah said. They exchanged a look, and it was clear he saw Zechariah's plan. From what they had seen, the Alewo had remained dormant since the Tepish arrived, so the Tepish would have no idea what the Alewo were capable of. It was unlikely that Nikolai even knew of the Alewo, beyond stories considering his age, so the idea that the large Deldral, whose home he had invaded, was more like a sleeping dragon than a sloth, had unlikely even entered into his mind. Finally, Tiberius nodded. "All right," he said. "It will be the Alewo forces with the 4 of us, if Yori is well." Yori nodded. "I'm ready," she said. "What about me?" David asked, walking up behind them. "This area will be defended," Ulrich said before anyone else could respond. "You may remain here with our medics, since you are still untrained." Zechariah nodded in agreement. Since this was a safe place, David needed to stay here away from the battle. He hoped that the boy might be useful at some juncture in the future, but Zechariah needed time to train him first. David also nodded and stood off to one side, continuing to listen to the conversation. Tiberius looked to Ulrich again, now changing his expression to one of preparation. "What is the strength of their forces?" Tiberius asked. "Over the past years," Ulrich replied, "they have grown their numbers to several thousand. But since they use this place as a training ground and send their troops elsewhere, only a few hundred are here. So as Kaltesh guessed, we're primarily fighting against new arrivals," Zechariah asked. "Their advantage will be their numbers," Ulrich cautioned, "so we must be careful not to get overwhelmed. My people treated them peaceably, for they had never interfered with us. I can set my Alewo to distract their forces throughout the plateau, while we set ourselves to remove the leader here, who, as you have probably guessed, is Nikolai. I have never seen a colder heart in all my days. He will show you no mercy should you come against him." "Where will we find him?" Zechariah asked. It grieved him to an extent that the people they would be fighting against were simply brainwashed by the Tepish way of bringing new people into their fold. But if the Tepish were going to fight, the Rostem would have little choice but to defeat them. "With this most recent development," Ulrich said, "he will make his home in the throne room, or in the quarters behind. He has been here for nearly 25 years. He knows the tunnels very well." "Brief your people," Tiberius said. "We'll start in a few hours. We will rely on you to lead us to the throne room." Ulrich gave Tiberius a bow. "I am at your service." The meeting broke at that point. Tiberius moved to one side with Kaltesh and Yori. Zechariah moved to follow them and noticed David standing alone watching them. This would be the first time Zechariah would leave him truly alone. He did not believe David would run into trouble surrounded by the Alewo who would remain here, but Zechariah was also the only person David actually knew, and that friendship was dubious at best. He had no doubt that David's loneliness would overwhelm him in short order, but he would be safe until Zechariah returned. If Zechariah was unable to return, then he knew whatever Alewo remained would at least set him on a worthwhile path.